In this episode, we move into one of the most important management responsibilities in security, because organizations cannot protect what they do not understand, and they cannot prioritize what they have never clearly identified. For a new learner, the phrase supervising risk identification and assessment may sound like a highly technical activity performed only by specialists in dark rooms studying threat reports all day. The reality is much broader and much more connected to how the business actually works. A security manager preparing for Certified Information Security Manager, CISM, needs to understand that this topic is about guiding the organization to notice where important exposure exists, evaluate what it could mean, and make sure the results are clear enough to support decisions. Strong supervision does not mean personally discovering every risk by yourself. It means creating a process, setting expectations, asking the right questions, involving the right people, and making sure the organization does not drift into danger simply because no one took ownership of seeing problems clearly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is by separating two ideas that are closely connected but not identical. Risk identification is the act of recognizing that something could happen which would affect the organization negatively, or that a weakness already exists that could lead to loss, disruption, failure, or harm. Risk assessment goes a step further by examining that identified risk and deciding how serious it is, how likely it may be, what parts of the business it could affect, and why it deserves a certain level of attention. Beginners sometimes combine these into one vague activity and assume the job is simply to make a list of bad things. That is not enough. Identification without assessment produces a pile of concerns with no clear direction, while assessment without solid identification creates false confidence because the organization may be measuring only the risks it already knows how to see. Supervising both means making sure the organization is not only spotting meaningful risk, but also evaluating it with enough care that leaders can act intelligently instead of reacting blindly. The word supervising matters here because the management role is different from the hands-on analytical role. A security manager may not personally inspect every system, interview every process owner, or review every change. Yet the manager is still accountable for making sure the organization has a reliable way to surface and examine important risks. That means setting a consistent approach, ensuring responsibilities are clear, checking whether the process covers the right parts of the business, and confirming that the results are usable by leadership. It also means noticing when risk work becomes too narrow, too informal, or too dependent on a small number of individuals. A weak supervisory approach says we trust our teams and assumes that risks will rise to the surface on their own. A strong supervisory approach asks how risks are being identified, whether the methods are working, whether assessments are comparable across teams, and whether important issues are being escalated in time. In CISM thinking, supervision is less about personally doing every task and more about making sure the organization is capable of doing the task well and repeatedly. Risk work becomes much stronger when it starts with business context rather than with a generic list of threats. Organizations do not face risk in the abstract. They face risk in relation to their people, services, information, systems, obligations, and the processes they rely on every day. If a security team begins by talking only about common attacks without understanding what the business depends on most, it may identify a large number of technically accurate concerns while still missing what would hurt the organization most deeply. This is why supervision begins with questions about critical services, important data, key dependencies, regulatory responsibilities, customer expectations, and the processes that keep daily operations moving. A billing platform, a manufacturing control system, a customer support workflow, and an executive approval process all carry different kinds of importance and different kinds of exposure. When a manager anchors risk identification in that business reality, the organization becomes better at spotting what matters instead of merely collecting scary possibilities that sound serious but may not deserve the same priority. Once the organization understands what matters most, it can look more clearly at where risk may come from. Risk does not appear only in the form of outside attackers trying to break in. It can come from poor process design, weak access management, third-party dependency, rush changes, unclear ownership, lack of training, fragile recovery arrangements, or simple human error in a high-impact area. It can also grow from outdated assumptions that no one has revisited because things have seemed stable for a long time. A beginner often imagines risk identification as a search for dramatic threats, but many important risks are quieter than that. They sit in the gaps between teams, in the processes everyone assumes are working, or in the systems that have become so routine that nobody looks closely anymore. Strong supervision makes sure identification efforts do not become trapped inside one narrow lens. It encourages the organization to examine technical, operational, human, legal, and external party sources of exposure so that the risk picture reflects how the business actually functions rather than how one team happens to view it. Business processes deserve special attention because risk often becomes visible only when you follow how work really moves through the organization. A process can involve people, approvals, data, systems, vendors, and time pressure all at once, which means it often reveals weaknesses that isolated technical review will miss. Think about a process that handles customer refunds, employee onboarding, or access to sensitive records. The main risk may not be a single missing control inside one system. It may be the way decisions pass from one team to another, the lack of review at a key step, or the fact that a manual workaround has quietly replaced the original approved method. When managers supervise identification well, they encourage teams to look at end-to-end activity rather than only at individual tools. That approach helps the organization discover where failure could happen in practice, not just where documentation says controls should exist. It also makes risk conversations more meaningful to business leaders because the discussion is tied to how work gets done, what could interrupt it, and where real harm could emerge. Assessment begins after a risk has been identified clearly enough to describe. The basic question is not simply whether the issue exists, but what it means for the organization if nothing changes. Most assessments consider some version of likelihood and impact, even if the organization uses simple words instead of complex models. Likelihood is about how plausible the event or failure is under current conditions, while impact is about the seriousness of the consequences if it occurs. A beginner sometimes thinks assessment must be extremely mathematical to be legitimate, but many organizations use structured judgment rather than precise financial calculation for every risk. The important point is consistency and reasoning. If one team calls a risk high because it feels uncomfortable, while another calls a similar risk moderate because it lacks a dramatic history, leadership will struggle to compare issues and decide where to focus. Supervising assessment means ensuring that the criteria are understood, that assumptions are examined, and that ratings are grounded in evidence and business context rather than personal instinct alone. Impact deserves careful thought because it can be broader than many new learners first realize. The immediate effect of a risk event might involve system downtime, data exposure, fraud, or process failure, but the full business effect may include customer dissatisfaction, legal problems, recovery expense, management distraction, lost confidence, missed deadlines, or harm to reputation that continues long after the technical problem is fixed. Some risks also create cascading effects. A disruption in one system may delay another process, overload customer support, trigger contract issues, and damage trust at a moment when the organization needs stability most. This is why a good assessment does not stop at the first visible consequence. It asks how far the effect could spread, how long it might last, and what parts of the organization would feel the pressure most. Supervisors need to encourage that wider view, because narrow assessments can make serious business risks appear smaller than they are. When impact is explored thoroughly, leadership gets a truer picture of why certain issues deserve more attention, stronger oversight, or faster treatment than others. One of the most useful habits in this area is learning to watch for common blind spots. Organizations often identify risks they are already accustomed to discussing, while missing the ones that sit just outside routine attention. They may focus on external threats and overlook internal process weaknesses or concentrate on major systems while ignoring the small manual steps that create exposure around those systems. They may also underestimate risks that develop gradually, such as growing exception use, incomplete inventories, unclear accountability, or aging controls that still exist on paper but no longer operate as intended. Another blind spot comes from familiarity. When a team has lived with a weakness for a long time without obvious harm, it may begin to treat that weakness as normal rather than risky. Good supervision challenges that comfort. It encourages fresh questions, cross-team discussion, and periodic re-examination so that the organization does not confuse the absence of recent disaster with the presence of sound control. In security management, some of the most damaging risks are not hidden because they are sophisticated. They are hidden because they have become ordinary. Strong risk identification and assessment also depend on good inputs, because the organization already receives many signals that can point toward emerging exposure. Incident history, near misses, audit results, control testing, customer complaints, technology changes, third-party issues, exception requests, and employee concerns can all reveal where the environment is weaker or more fragile than it appears. Even a pattern of small operational failures can be a clue that a larger security or resilience problem is forming beneath the surface. A manager supervising this work should make sure these inputs are not trapped inside separate teams with no shared visibility. If operations sees a repeating breakdown, if internal review sees policy drift, and if the security team sees alerting problems, those pieces may describe the same growing risk when placed together. That is why supervision involves more than approving a form or reading a summary report. It involves making sure the organization listens to the right signals, connects them thoughtfully, and treats them as part of a living risk picture instead of a collection of disconnected observations. Collaboration matters because no single person or department has a complete view of business risk. Security teams may understand threats and control design, but business owners understand the value and fragility of their processes. Technology teams understand dependencies and change patterns. Legal and compliance groups understand obligations and exposure from another angle. Operations teams see what pressure does to routines, while frontline staff often know where workarounds and weak spots live in day-to-day practice. Supervising risk identification and assessment therefore requires more than asking people for input once in a while. It requires building a process where those perspectives can be gathered, compared, and challenged constructively. This is especially important because people often describe the same problem differently depending on their role. A business manager may call something a delivery risk, an engineer may call it a configuration issue, and the security team may call it a control weakness. All three may be pointing at the same exposure. A mature supervisor helps the organization bring those views together so that risk is understood in a fuller and more actionable way. Documentation is another major part of supervision because unclear records make it hard to compare risks, track ownership, or communicate meaningfully with leadership. A useful risk record should capture what the risk is, what process or asset it affects, why it matters, what assumptions shape the assessment, who owns it, and how serious it currently appears. Without that kind of discipline, risk discussions can become repetitive and vague. Teams may keep rediscovering the same issue, disagreeing over whether it was already known, or struggling to explain how one assessment relates to another. Good documentation does not mean turning risk work into bureaucracy for its own sake. It means preserving enough clarity that decisions can be revisited, progress can be tracked, and comparisons can be made honestly across time and across functions. Supervisors should also make sure the language used in documentation is understandable outside the security team. If a risk record is so technical that leaders cannot tell what business consequences at stake, then the assessment may be accurate in detail while failing in management value. Another important lesson is that identification and assessment are not one-time events. Risk changes as the business changes. New products, new vendors, reorganizations, market pressure, staffing changes, cloud adoption, legacy system aging, and shifts in regulation can all change the risk picture even if no dramatic incident has occurred. A risk that looked acceptable last year may deserve a much higher level of concern now because the business relies on that process more heavily or because the environment around it has grown more complex. The opposite can also be true when controls improve or dependencies are reduced. This is why strong supervision includes reassessment triggers and recurring review rather than a belief that once a risk has been rated, it can sit untouched for long periods. Managers should expect risk work to be ongoing, because supervision is really about maintaining visibility as conditions evolve. That continuous view helps the organization avoid stale assumptions and keeps leadership from making decisions based on outdated pictures of the environment. Perhaps the most important misconception to leave behind is the idea that risk identification and assessment are mainly paperwork exercises performed to satisfy governance expectations. They certainly support governance, but their deeper purpose is decision quality. When the organization identifies risk well and assesses it honestly, leaders can prioritize resources, accept or reject trade-offs, and respond to emerging issues with much greater confidence. When this work is weak, decisions become distorted. Serious risks may be treated like minor concerns. Minor issues may consume too much energy, and important gaps may remain hidden until they become incidents. Supervising this process means protecting the organization from that kind of decision blindness. It means insisting on business context, meaningful collaboration, disciplined assessment, useful documentation, and continuous review. For a new learner studying CISM, that is the real value of the topic. Risk supervision is not simply about describing danger. It is about helping the organization see clearly enough to act wisely before uncertainty becomes loss. As we close, the main lesson is that supervising risk identification and assessment is one of the central ways security management becomes practical and influential. The manager's role is not to memorize every possible threat or personally analyze every weakness, but to ensure the organization has a reliable way to discover meaningful exposure, evaluate it in business terms, and communicate the results clearly enough for action. That requires understanding what the business depends on, recognizing where risk can come from, examining likelihood and impact thoughtfully, drawing on multiple perspectives, maintaining good records, and revisiting conclusions as the environment changes. When those pieces are in place, risk work becomes something far more valuable than a compliance ritual. It becomes a way of guiding judgment, protecting priorities, and helping the organization use its attention and resources where they matter most. For someone new to security management, that is an important shift in perspective. Strong security leadership begins not with guessing which danger sounds the loudest, but with building a disciplined way to identify, assess, and supervise risk before it becomes harm.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.